Hi everyone, my name is James Feeney. Welcome to or back to my channel. Today we are here with a recap or a favorites video, a reflection on the month of January as it has now passed. So as usual, without any further ado, we get into the decks, then the books that I read, and then sort of miscellaneous things like experiences and items that are a bit random. So jumping right into the decks, this month I actually do have a few to share compared to some months where it's just the Thoth deck and that's about it. Of course, the Thoth deck is in this group, the trimmed one, client readings, my readings, all of those sorts of things. It's constantly in use, so it's always going to be a favorite and a mainstay and a focal point of the month. But yeah, so Thoth. But we do have a few other tarot decks here, one of which will be no surprise if you've watched any of my videos from January, but it is the Dreamer's Tarot by Marcella Kroll. I posted a sort of walkthrough review of this deck and spoke about it in terms of my work with the inner child and starting to maybe hone some of my more personal intuition for myself. I also used it in this intuitive child spread that I posted not too long ago. The backs look like this. It has this really pretty silver iridescent edging to it, and personally I've just really loved the simplicity and color palette of this deck and its use in activities that are a bit more intuitive and things like that that I am not as keen on usually. Usually I gear myself more toward heavy symbolism, occult, a lot going on, picking things apart, getting very analytical with my decks and how I interpret them, but this deck has been something that I've wanted to use to maybe hold that sort of feeling off in favor of my other faculties as a diviner. So this has been a great big favorite for me, and her corresponding oracle decks, I don't have them here. I didn't use them too much, but I mostly turned to them in reference of this deck to see where Marcella Kroll, the artist, was coming from in the creation of this, because the two oracle decks did precede this by years, so it felt like they were connected in some way, and that was really interesting. And then in doing work with this, in investigating my inner child, I had some really fun and interesting and just wild experiences that I wouldn't have expected, mostly in the form of dreams that were really vivid and powerful and that I could tie to the idea of my childhood and feelings that I had as a child. And so it was very interesting how that sort of correlated and related throughout my month and created this series of experiences, both in my dreams and in my real world. So that was very, very interesting to have happen. Possibly more on that later, but the Dreamer's Tarot was a big favorite. I don't think it's available now or at this exact moment, but it should be back on Marcella Kroll's Etsy page in the coming weeks, so stay tuned if you don't see it. Next, as far as tarot goes, is the Tarot of the Alchemical Magnum Opus. I talk about this deck on and off pretty often. It is one of my big mainstay decks, one that I favor of Robert M. Place's, and I really tend to like almost all of his decks. And in comparison to the other alchemical, or the normal alchemical tarot, or the traditional one, I do tend to use this one a bit more. I've talked about how I like the more minimal art style to it, and so it has been around this month, and there's a reason that it's been around a bit more this month than even in normal months. But just a quick peek, because I've shown this a bunch. It is one of my favorites. It continues to be a favorite, and it made a reappearance for a reason that I'm about to mention soon. So yes, but it was a favorite, and it was one that got used pretty often, mostly in personal readings. I don't use this one as much for clients, mostly because I don't think a client wants to go through dissecting the symbolism of a card and going through all of that. I don't think that that's very pleasurable. I tend to try to use decks that I can ground and find practical meaning in for clients so that it can be relatable and easy to understand. Although the Thoth is a deck that's kind of esoteric and occult and highly symbolic, I am able to relate that very easily to the real world and practical elements. Whereas with this deck, I do see it as more of like a treat for myself to pull out and investigate. So this is not one I would primarily use with others very often. And then the last tarot deck to show is the Tarocco Sopraffino. This is the, what is it, the one of the Lo Scarabeo. It's a sort of collection that they do where they bring back old decks and sort of republish them, and it's all usually in the same sort of formatted type box. I don't tend to like Lo Scarabeo decks. This is one I got this month. I purchased it during the holidays, and then it appeared, of course, in January, or arrived, didn't appear. It had to get there by some means. But I've been really into classical decks and the history of tarot. I've been wanting to investigate more Marseille-style decks and get into that this year. I was talking to Anna from Astral Lady Tarot about this, and she just posted a really great video going over, she has many videos on reading the Marseille, but one where she spoke to a book by Jodorowsky and went through the cards just in general. And so I'm pretty keen on investigating that further. I know I've spoken about playing card divination and that being a big part of my 2020, but I thought I've never gotten on too well with Marseille, but I do like playing cards now, so why not try to sort of slip Marseille in there as an additive, and maybe I'll be more receptive to it now. So that's something that I'm excited for, and something that I started to dip my toes into this past month. I didn't read any books on Marseille, but I am now that it is February, so stay tuned for all that stuff, but definitely check out Anna's channel. She has a wealth of knowledge on the Marseille and videos that I find to be really helpful as somebody who is quite a novice, or at least that's my least developed area of tarot, is the Marseille system and the classical side there. So I did get this Tarocco Sopraffino deck. It's really cute and small and tiny, as a lot of the older, more classical decks are. They tend to be more narrow and, narrow and tall, and then just small in general. It doesn't have that really cheap, not cheap, I mean, Lo Scarabeo cardstock is pretty standard, but I don't get on with it very well. It has its own sort of finish to it. They're quite thick and almost, I don't want to say waxy, they're like papery and waxy. I've really been enjoying it. I know that this is an Italian deck. I'm not sure if it would technically be classified as Marseille, but I do know that the pips, or the minors, follow the formations of the classical Marseille. So in that, at least, I guess it could be considered one. But I've really been enjoying it. It's kind of just a fun deck to break out and read by candlelight, or feel just sort of old school when I'm using it. So I've mostly been enjoying it for novelty purposes, but it's also a bit of a study deck, and I feel like I can get messages out of a deck like that. I just would like to know more of the foundations and text that went into it so that I could really make a lot more sense and go the extra mile with it. But the Tarocco Sopraffino has been a really fun one. You can get this, I think, on Amazon or just through Lo Scarabeo. It is really nice. Like I said, it's not their classical cardstock. It's really this type of cardstock that I think they use for these sort of editions of bringing back older decks. So it wasn't a disappointment at all, and I'm really enjoying it. So I think that takes us through the tarot decks of the month. I do have a few oracle decks and playing card decks, which you could consider oracle. I kind of don't. I consider it its own thing. So we'll just go, actually, I don't have any oracle. I just have a playing card, so we'll just go there. So the one I think I use the most this month, primarily for study, but I do readings on myself every single day with playing cards, and do readings for more so acquaintances and family members, because I'm still gaining my footing with playing card divination. I wouldn't want to offer that for a client reading where somebody pays quite yet. I don't feel like I'm there quite yet. So this is the Pagan Playing Cards by Usi, however you say it. I may have mentioned this in other videos or other favorites videos. This is, I think, the Ivory edition, so it has the backs that are like this. I think this is the one that's in print right now. They had other editions that have gone out. It's pretty straightforward. So while I love Anna Cortez's playing card decks, there is a lot of illustration going on in the pips and the minors, and I felt like I wanted to be able to stand on my own without some illustration to guide me along toward a meaning. So I've been using this, especially the past month, but even in previous months, as my more standard playing card deck that has just the lesser illustrated pips, the traditional court cards, and all of that. So this one's really nice. It's high quality like most Usi things. It's pretty straightforward. I do really love the courts when they come up. They do have a very evocative feeling to them. There's a lot of depth, more so than, for example, just your basic mass-produced playing card deck that you would probably use for a game. I like that there is attention to detail with some of course, the aces, which tend to have a little flourish to them. And then all of the courts are very much their own in their own right. So there is personality there, which I appreciate. So that was probably the biggest playing card deck that I used this month, the one I was using the most frequently and just tossing in my bag. And it's a really durable, high-quality deck as well, so I appreciate it for that. And then the other one, and this will correlate to the fact that the Alchemical Magnum Opus made sort of a reprise, although it's always kind of on my reading table and in use. But the reason that it was touched and used a bit more was because I did finally get the Robert M. Place, the Hermes playing card Oracle, or the Hermes playing cards. I had to pre-order these all the way back in, I want to say November. They were kind of just out of print, or he was out of stock, so he had to reorder from the printer. It took a while for them to come in, and then they arrived this month in January, so I'm happy about that. So I've gotten to use them. I was very curious about this specific deck because, of course, it's Robert M. Place, and there's a lot of interesting things that go on in his decks, but also because, of course, there's his art style, but the cards are a bit different. So all of the pips or the minors do have some very simple element in the center. So here we get a bear, a lamb, a cross. Now, you may notice that the cards that correspond to Lenormand cards will have the traditional Lenormand thing going on, symbol going on them. So the cross, for example, is a big Lenormand one. And then all of the cards do get some sort of symbol, and the court cards are all a little bit different, which I do appreciate, but every card gets something, whether it pertains to its actual sort of traditional meaning or not. Playing cards are a little bit unique like that. It's definitely hard to find one standard traditional system that is adhered to by everybody who uses playing cards. I've spoken about this before, but they're very folky, or at least a lot of the writing around playing cards and the history and divinatory aspects to playing cards tend to be very folky in nature and fluid and personalized by certain people. So this deck can easily become a Lenormand with the actual symbols on the cards if you just take those cards out. Likewise, you can use the whole deck as just a playing card divination sort of thing. And so it's very multi-purpose in that way. I'm not a big Lenormand person, but I've been picking up the basics just through reading books on playing card divination, because there's always those chapters on that, whether or not the whole book is centered around it. So I guess I know the basics of Lenormand. It's not a system that I use all the time. I'm more so interested in using the whole deck, but I think there's something to Lenormand, and I guess the charm of it has grown on me more so than it was before I started reading with playing cards in general. This deck, I just like how there's that one simple thing, so it's not like it's feeding me or spoon-feeding me anything. It's not showing me a scene. It doesn't make me feel like I'm cheating when I derive a meaning from it. It doesn't make me think that I'm not being intuitive. It makes me feel like I can create a storybook or something like that. So if the lion meets a fox, what happens? If the horseshoe collides with the sword, what happens? You know, things like that. So I've been using it very narrative style. I like to use decks of cards in general, tarot and playing card, for more than just divination. I like to use them for magic, for storytelling, for understanding the world around me. I think that transposing the idea of the cards as universal archetypes and energies and really just creative sort of talismans can be very, very valuable. So I use the cards all the time during my day, sometimes just not even for readings, but to illustrate things for myself in a way that can provide valuable insights that I maybe wouldn't have reached otherwise, and things like that. So this has been a big one for me this month, and of course it looks really nice with his art style, so pairing it with another one of my favorite tarot decks is a bonus. So that takes us through all of the decks this month. Now we'll get into the books. Just put this over here without knocking everything over. So we have 4 books this month. I've kind of reached the conclusion that 4 books on average, on a month where things are just going very steadily, 4 books is usually what I do, or on average a book a week, with between like work and everything I have to get done. If everything goes to plan, it's usually 1 book a week, which to me feels like a good amount, and it feels kind of like a lot, especially when I reflect on a whole year's worth of books. But then I see booktubers that I watch and Katie Flowers, and I don't feel like this is a lot. So for me, it's a good amount. I don't know if it would be considered maybe a lot in a month or not so much. Maybe it's a lot of these are kind of light reading, actually. Without further ado, I guess we'll just get into them. I don't know why I'm rambling on about my book reading habits, but the first one I read and really loved was The Phlebotomist by Chris Panettiere. This is a novel. It's a science fiction novel, or at least that's the section it's in, and I would categorize it as science fiction. It's a really wonderful read. It's not a short one by any stretch, or at least it's not a super short one. It's like a little over 300 pages. I like science fiction and fantasy. I've mentioned this before, and as much as I like to read occult books and tarot books and all those sorts of things, I would like to make a point of maybe reading at least a novel a month. To me, they're more of a pleasurable thing, something that I'll take a bath and read, or I'll give myself maybe a half an hour in the morning if I can manage it to read some of it, or at night before bed. To me, these are a treat. These are novels are things I look forward to reading. They're like touchstones I can put in my day to reward myself time reading those. So a novel a month would be nice, if not more. Now, this one is sort of this dystopian futuristic type of world that is based on, I think it's supposed to take place in America or the United States, and it follows an older woman who was a phlebotomist before the world sort of went south, or, I mean, you could argue the world's going south, but in this world, before things really got bad, before there was this nuclear fallout or things of that nature, she was a phlebotomist, and now there's this sort of currency of blood in the world, because a lot of people need blood, and there's a lot that goes into it, and I don't want to give too many things away. I like the fact that the protagonist is an older woman, as opposed to these sort of youthful, coming-of-age type characters who are very much in their prime. I'm saying prime in quotes because I don't think that youth is necessarily equated to being in the prime of your life, but I like that we have an older protagonist, an older woman, actually a grandmother, who takes care of her grandson, and so that added nuance and complexity. It's also nice because this was a little bit more of a diverse book as far as race goes, so it does investigate things like class and race and society and values and morals and ethics through the lens of this really fun dystopian world. I don't want to give too many things away, but it was exciting to read. It kept me on my toes. There's a lot that goes on in it, a lot of thought that went into the world making and the character building. So I loved this one. I really, really liked it. I do recommend it if anybody out there is looking for a good science fiction novel to read. The first person that comes to my mind that would like this is probably Laura from Aquamarine 1918. Oh my gosh, is it Aquamarine 19 or 18? Laura, if you do happen to watch this, I think this is one for you. So really enjoyed that. The next one that I read and finished was Secrets of the Thoth Tarot, Volume 3, The Sanctuary of Transcendental Art, Court Cards and Reading Methods for the Thoth Tarot by Marcus Katz. You will have seen that last month I finished the second volume. The month before that, I read the first volume, and I mentioned this in my recent book, or my recent video that I made on Thoth book recommendations and study tips, where I speak to it a little bit as well, but this was an enjoyable one. This one focuses on the court cards, so it was nice to see how those were broken down, and I think the court cards in general are a facet of the tarot that is often the hardest to read, the most sort of, you just need more where they're concerned. So I was glad that I actually got through this. This, I think, was my favorite of the 3 volumes, and if I only read one, or I only had to read one, knowing what they were about, I would pick this one. So if you're out there and you're looking maybe to cherry pick and you want a taste of these volumes without committing to buying all 3, I think the court cards you'll get the most out of if you are a Thoth reader of any sort. So that was really valuable and fun. And then that kind of felt like a nice completion to the fact that I finished the series, and it's nice when you can look at a series of volumes and think to yourself, oh, I read all those. So that was nice. And the next one that I read and finished was A Deed Without a Name, Unearthing the Legacy of Traditional Witchcraft by Lee Morgan, with illustrations by Brett Morgan. So this is more so an investigation into more traditional facets of folk witchcraft, as far as I could tell. It is more centered in European folk witchcraft. There's a lot of references to Italy, to Ireland, and then other sort of more so, I would say, Western European countries. There are some references to Russia, Siberia, and a few, I think, Asian countries, if I'm not mistaken, but it is a little bit more Eurocentric following those traditions. So if you're picking it up, wondering where it's kind of based in and coming from, it dissects those aspects, and it is more folky and old school than it is ceremonial and modern. So do with that what you will. It takes these sort of ideas and tenets and practices that are very much part of the mythos that goes into what makes up traditional witchcraft, like flying and what that means, and the idea of more subtle aspects and what that actually might be getting to in terms of shamanic experiences or out-of-body experiences, astral travel, how energy works. So it tries to make sense of and create modern language to better understand and explain what a lot of these older tales and traditional myths that we know of witchcraft from centuries past in Europe, if that makes sense. It was really, really interesting the way it was broken down, and there is a sort of practical aspect to it where you can take some of those exercises, if you will, and use them for yourself or incorporate them into your own practice. And it was the kind of book that gets you feeling very magical as you're reading it, and it makes you think that maybe other things are possible outside of the norm. And so this was one I enjoyed. It's not a super long read, but I think it's one you would benefit from taking your time with and not trying to just rush through it. There was a lot of attention to the wording, to the stories that were curated. There are a lot of examples of modern witchcrafts and modern witchcraft practitioners and their stories sort of being told in here, as well as sourcing of older sort of myths. So that was really fun and definitely one I enjoyed and would recommend. Next and finally, we have, I'm not sure how I would describe this title. Every Card Tells a Story, Playing Card Divination, or Playing Card Divination, Every Card Tells a Story by Stephen Ball. I know he has other books out there, and he references a book that he has that I think is of a similar format that he has on divination through dice, through just standard six-sided dice. But this one was one that I really enjoyed. It did actually stand out to me from other books I've read on playing card divination. Like all books, the system is going to be different. Every single book I've read has had a different sort of traditional core meaning tied to a card. So, like I said, that's frustrating, but it's also really fun. I really do wish maybe there was a little bit more standardization where playing cards are concerned, but I understand how their history has been, so that really just couldn't have been the case so much. But in this one here, the reason I think it stood out the most was that Stephen Ball takes the time to create a system of his own and explain it pretty well. So each number going through the suits has a role. So the 5s are warriors. Let me just make sure I'm getting this correctly. The 6s are the singers. So they all sort of have this archetypal role based on the number. And then the suit itself has a sort of key word or aspect that it speaks to in terms of each archetype. So all of the clubs are promises. All of the spades are follies. All of the diamonds are gambits. So you get things like the warrior's gambit for the 5 of diamonds, or you get the noble's folly for the 7 of spades. So it does create a system. And then on top of that, he has a fictional story that he creates, a very short fictional story for each card to illustrate the basic idea or the basic energy of the card. So the name of, for example, the 7 of spades, the noble's folly, is Tatiana, Queen of the World. And so you get this very, maybe like 1 or 2 page story of a girl in this mystical land and what happens to her, or what she does, or what befalls her. And that is meant to illustrate the idea of the card. And then there's a sort of dissection after the story, meant to break it down in a more practical, divinatory way, but letting you know that the story connects to the idea of the card as the system is constructed. And I find that really helpful as a study mechanism. I almost wanted to call it a sort of mnemonic, but it's not quite that. It really is, though, that when you see the card, you might remember the story better than you will remember keywords or basic ideas. I think the way the human mind works, or at least mine, is that I can look at the card and remember the story a lot more easily than I can remember a few paragraphs that tell me what the card is supposed to speak to. So I can be like, oh, this is the story when the guy was holding the bow and arrow in a competition, or this is the story where the guy went into the castle and had to confront the magical queen who wanted to kill him, or something like that. It's a lot easier for me to think in those terms, and so I found this book to be really helpful. So if anybody out there is looking to learn playing card divination and wants a really interesting archetypal system combined with a really fun way to memorize and learn the cards, I would definitely recommend this. This is, I think, outside of Anna Cortez's books, I think this was my favorite playing card divination book that I've read. So it was a very, very fun one, and a lot of short stories. You could almost consider it a compilation of short stories, which I appreciate. So that takes us through decks and books, which usually makes up the bulk of my recaps or favorites videos. I don't have too much in the way of miscellaneous items. Two things that I've used a lot in my magical practice this month are the same as last month: my rattle, which is shaped like a crescent moon, and my drum, which has been being used. I mentioned the fact that I like to use these items a lot more in the winter, specifically the drum, because I think in cold, dry weather, the drum sounds better. When it gets too humid, my area gets quite hot and humid during the warmer months, so the drum sound just isn't quite the same, and so I like using it a lot more in the winter. Plus, the energy from a drum to me feels very warm and inviting and invigorating. It has a sort of vitality that I want to bring into my experience during the colder months. And then the rattle for me is more of this disruptive cleansing, if you will. It also kind of feels like this trickster energy. I don't know why, but for me, when I'm rattling away, I feel a little bit like I should be like skipping or prancing. I don't know why that is. So those are big favorites for me in my magical practice. And then on another note, we have, I guess I just pulled these out to share. One is this sort of timer. I found this to be really helpful for me now that I do time-based readings for clients. So that way I don't have to set an alarm or have something that makes an annoying sound to keep track of the time. I guess you could probably do something like an hourglass, or I'm sure there are other methods, but for me, I like this because if I'm sitting at a table in the shop, which is how it works, I can face the timer towards me, set it up, and that way the client doesn't see the time, so they don't start to feel like, oh, I should ask this, or they don't start to feel like they're running out of time. Only I can see the time, and so it starts to blink when it's done, so it catches my eye, but that's usually my way of wrapping up the reading or knowing it's about time. And of course, over all of the time I've been doing this, I generally am pretty spot on with how long it takes a reading to go, and just it's reaching its conclusion as the time runs out. But it is helpful for me just as a benchmark, and also using this in the tarot class I'm teaching as we do practice readings, and how to rotate the table so that everybody can talk to each other, or when we do activities, I want a timer that lets me be able to keep track of very standard segments of time, so that way the class doesn't sort of run away from me and all of a sudden we're out of time and I don't have time to do a wrap up or anything like that. So just a silent timer has been really helpful for me in my professional readings and also teaching of classes. So if you do either of those things, maybe look into this. This was like $5 on Amazon and it works like a charm. It's really, really helpful. And then I don't know if I've ever shown this, but it's one that I've been using the past couple months, but more so now that it's like teaching a class, going to the shop, doing this, doing that. Just my tote bag. I'm a big tote bag person when it comes to carrying my stuff. I can chuck my laptop, maybe a couple books, decks in it. I can throw everything in a tote bag, and I'm really good at like organizing it so it all fits perfectly. And this is just the one that I have currently. I kind of just use them till they wear out, and I like ones that feel very fun and interesting. This is just supposed to be, I guess, different types of butterflies, and it is kind of already wearing out. The other day I noticed a little bit of a hole in the bottom, which is a shame, but it has a lot of time left in it, I think. It's a thick canvas material, and something that I use, I think I've shown this before a while back, but when I go to the shop, when I do classes, this is where I'll usually put the decks that I'm bringing. I think it's meant to be more of like a pencil case type thing, but it's a nice canvas and it zips. And I can usually fit like, oh, there's a business card in there. Interesting. Not even my business card, one somebody gave me at the shop. But I can usually fit like 3 decks in here, 3 good sized decks. So that usually works for me to put maybe like a Thoth, a playing card deck, and one other that I seem to be liking at the moment, whatever that may be. So that's what I've been using a lot lately as far as materials. And then as far as experiences go, it has been actually a busier month, one with client readings, which have picked up, which I'm really, really thankful for. It was well, if you do client readings, it was kind of slow with the pandemic for quite some time. It's not quite back to where it was, and I can't exactly do events in the way that I was, but reading in the shop and even online, it has picked up a little bit recently, which I feel really grateful for because it makes me feel like, you know, I can do this and it's not just going on a downward trend. So that's been really fun and nice. And of course, being able to go to the shop and having that experience, even though it's a little bit obviously different during these times, is very nice. And outside of that, teaching my class, which I wasn't sure how that would go, and everything's touch and go with things and policies being the way that they are, but that's been working out and I'm really grateful for it. I love my students. They're really awesome people. And this is the first time that I get to teach solely alone. So I'm doing everything the way that I want to do it. And of course, that adds some more responsibility. So it's been a little bit of a learning curve, but not really so much. I did have classes in the past where I was able to co-teach, so that let me become more comfortable. And so I feel great doing this. And then for my students, one fun sort of experience I had was creating a bit of a tarot write-up that became more like a short tarot book. I teach, and in the beginning of the classes, it's more lecture style. I use the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and we go through the traditional meanings, some correspondences, breaking down of the symbolism and the structuring of the tarot system, and all of that. So the first few classes, or the beginnings of the classes, usually are a little bit more lecture style, and I don't want the students to feel pressured to write things down super quickly or feel like they missed something or something like that. I'd rather them just be able to experience, hold their own card, really listen to what I'm saying, and be able to ask questions they're genuinely curious about without having to worry about writing every little thing down. So I told them I would make them a pretty comprehensive write-up that would go over everything we went over in class. And I'm really glad that I decided to do that, but I think I bit off a little bit more than I could chew, or more than I thought I was going to have to chew, and it became more of like a close to 40 pages single-space document with quite a lot going on in it, but I'm really glad that I have it for future classes, for my own reference, and something that I can maybe add to going forward. And now I have like this little small tarot book of my own making. So to me, that was a valuable exercise for me as a reader, as a student, as a teacher, and I feel really proud of the fact that I can now offer this to people, to students who are in my class. It feels like something very tangible they can take with them that I've created just for them, and so it adds, in my opinion, value to the class for them, so I'm happy about that. That about wraps things up. Those are some experiences, some items, my decks and books. I hope that was enjoyable and helpful for anybody out there, and I'm sorry if the lighting was weird. We're having a bit of a snowstorm, which I love, but it does make things a bit darker, so I hope everything was pretty visible. Let me know what you guys have been enjoying this month. I'm sure I will have checked out your favorites video, like I am many. Each month I do enjoy watching those, so if I haven't, maybe link me. I like watching them. But I hope this was helpful and enjoyable. Like and subscribe if you had fun here and want to hang out some more. And until next time, bye.